The telegram had said she'd arrive on the noon stage. Cade Rourke showed up at 11:30, which told him more about himself than he cared to admit. He stood at the edge of Redwood Flat's single main street, with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed, and his jaw set in that particular way that made men cross to the other side of the road, and women pretend they hadn't noticed him at all. The town moved around him like water around a stone. Merchants hauling crates, children chasing a dog that didn't want to be caught. Old Hector Briggs sweeping dust off his porch steps in a direction that made no mathematical sense. Normal. All of it normal. Except for the thing coiled in Cade's chest that he refused to call nerves. He was 34 years old. He had built the Rourke Ranch from collapse with his own 2 hands after his father drank it nearly into the ground. He had faced down a mountain lion on the North Ridge in the dark, with nothing but a hunting knife and the stubborn conviction that he was not ready to die. He had buried his father, his mother, and the last version of himself that believed the world operated on anything resembling fairness. He was not nervous about a woman arriving on a stage. He was simply present, early, watching. That was all. The stage came in at 3 minutes past noon, trailing a column of red dust that hung in the dry August air like smoke. 4 horses, hard driven. The driver hauled back on the reins with the casual brutality of a man who'd made this run 400 times and stopped noticing the scenery somewhere around trip number 12. 2 men climbed out first, a traveling merchant with a sample case and sweat rings beneath both arms. A lawyer Cade vaguely recognized from a land dispute 3 years ago. They exchanged the specific nod of men who had no quarrel but no warmth either. Then the door opened again, and Cade Rourke, who had faced mountain lions in the dark, forgot how to breathe. She was not what he expected. He didn't know exactly what he'd expected. The arrangement had been handled, through letters, through his lawyer's careful language, through paperwork that reduced the whole complicated business to signatures and dates and mutual benefit. Practical, transactional. He had expected practical. He had expected someone who looked like the word practical. Mae Sutton did not look like any word he had a name for. She was tall, taller than he'd imagined, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a way that the journey had partially undone, so that loose strands curled against her jaw and the back of her neck in a manner that was almost certainly not intentional and was therefore twice as devastating. Her dress was plain dark blue, travel-worn at the hem. She carried a single bag leather, old, the strap repaired with what looked like a piece of harness leather, and she set it down on the boardwalk with the deliberate care of someone managing something heavier than its weight suggested. She looked up. Her eyes found him immediately, gray-green, clear, unsettling in their directness, the way a still river is unsettling, because you can't tell how deep it runs. She did not smile. She studied him the way you study a piece of ground before you commit your weight to it. Then she picked up her bag, walked across the street, stopped 2 feet in front of him and said, "You're Cade Rourke. You're taller than I expected." "You're—" he started. "Mae Sutton." She extended her hand, firm, businesslike. The handshake of a woman who'd learned early that if she didn't establish her own terms, someone else would establish them for her. "I know the arrangement. I've read the paperwork. I have questions, but they can wait until we're somewhere that isn't a public street." Cade looked down at her hand in his, released it, cleared his throat. "Wagons this way," he said. "Good." She followed him without another word. He was acutely, painfully aware of the eyes tracking them from every storefront window. Redwood Flats was a town of 412 people, which meant it was a town of 412 opinions about everyone else's business. And Cade Rourke showing up at the noon stage to collect a wife he'd arranged through a lawyer was going to keep those opinions occupied for the better part of a month. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, without thinking about it, reached up, offered his hand, and she took it with the same matter-of-fact practicality she'd applied to the handshake. No flutter. No performance. Just a woman getting onto a wagon, because a wagon needed to be gotten onto. Cade climbed up the other side and pointed the horses home. They drove in silence for 4 miles. Good silence, Cade told himself. Efficient silence. The silence of 2 practical people who had entered into a practical arrangement and had no need to fill the air with false warmth. Not awkward, not heavy. Not the specific, charged kind of silence that happened when a man was too aware of the person sitting 18 inches to his left and couldn't figure out what to do with that awareness. "How long since you worked it alone?" Mae asked. He glanced at her. She was looking at the land, reading it the way you read a face, taking inventory. Her eyes moved across the ridge lines, the condition of the fence posts visible from the road, the color of the grass in the lower pasture. 3 years, he said. Had a hand until the spring. Couldn't keep paying him. She nodded. No pity in it. Just information received and filed. The letters said the east pasture fence is failing. Most of it. And the well on the north field. Drops in August. Recovers by October. That's workable. She was still reading the land. The soil looks better than I expected. Whatever your father did or didn't do, the land itself is sound. Cade's jaw tightened slightly. You know about my father. Your lawyer mentioned some history. I'm not interested in the history. She turned to look at him then, direct and unambiguous. I'm interested in what's here now and what it can become. Is that a problem? He looked at her for a moment. The afternoon light was hitting the left side of her face and doing things to the loose strands of her hair that he was going to stop noticing immediately. No problem, he said. She turned back to the land. He turned back to the horses. And something shifted in the air between them, imperceptible, small as a single degree of change, but shifts that small were the ones that moved everything, eventually. The ranch house sat at the end of a long dirt track flanked by cottonwoods that Cade's grandfather had planted 60 years ago. They were the tallest living things for 3 miles in any direction, and in the late afternoon light they turned a color that had no real name, something between gold and copper, and the particular shade of almost gone that made... You understand why people stayed in places that were hard on them. Mae stepped down from the wagon before he could offer his hand a second time. She stood in front of the house and looked at it. Cade stood beside her and looked at it through her eyes and felt the familiar compound of defensiveness and shame that the house had been producing in him for years, peeling paint on the shutters. The porch step that gave too much underweight. The window on the east side he'd patched with oilskin because the glass had cracked in February, and glass cost money that kept needing to be spent on other things first. It needs work, he said, preemptively, defensively. Everything worth having does. She walked up the porch steps, tested the bad one, noted it, stepped over it, and pushed open the front door. He followed her inside. She moved through the rooms with that same quiet inventory she'd applied to the landscape. Kitchen first. Ran her hand along the table edge, checked the state of the stove, opened the door of the larder, and looked at what was there without comment. Then the main room, the 2 smaller rooms. She stopped at the door of the larger bedroom and looked in without entering. I'll take the smaller room, she said. That one's got the better light. I'm not here for the light. She turned to face him. I'm here because I needed somewhere to be, and you needed someone capable. That's the arrangement. I don't want the better room, Cade. I haven't earned it. Something about the way she said it, not meek, not self-deprecating, just plainly honest in a way that landed differently from any kind of humility he'd encountered before, made him go quiet. All right, he said. Smaller room. Thank you. She moved back toward the kitchen. I'll make something from what's in the larder. We should talk about what needs doing first. I want to start on the fence line tomorrow if the ground's not too hard. You've worked fence before? She glanced back at him over her shoulder. Something moved behind her eyes. A memory, or the shadow of one. I've worked most things. You'll see. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and watched a woman he'd known for less than 2 hours begin efficiently dismantling his assumption that he knew what to expect from any of this. He should have felt invaded, unsettled. He'd lived alone in this house for 3 years, and the silence had become structural load-bearing almost. He'd arranged this because the ranch needed it, because the numbers demanded it, because his lawyer had explained in patient detail that a working partnership was the only remaining option between him and losing the land his grandfather had broken himself to build. He should feel a lot of things right now. Instead, standing there in the long amber light of a Montana August evening, Cade Rourke felt, and this was the word he would spend the next several weeks, refusing to use something dangerously close to relief. She was up before him. He woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots on the porch, and was halfway to defensive before he remembered there was a person in his house now, and that was the point. Mae was sitting on the front step with a mug in both hands, looking east at the sky going pale above the ridge. She didn't look back when she heard the door. Just held out a second mug she'd set on the step beside her. He took it, sat down. The wood was cold and the coffee was strong and the sky was doing something complicated in shades of gray and rose that he'd stopped noticing somewhere around year 2 of working the ranch alone. I counted the cattle this morning, Mae said. He looked at her. It's 5:30. I know. I count better when it's quiet. She wrapped both hands around her mug. You're short 11 head from what the records show. 3, I think, are on the wrong side of the north fence. The others. She paused. You've been selling down. It wasn't an accusation. That was the thing about the way she said things. They arrived like weather present, factual, impossible to argue with. When I had to, he said. I know. She drank her coffee. I'm not criticizing. I'm taking stock of where we actually are, as opposed to where the paperwork says we are. Those are usually different numbers. Usually. Always, in my experience. She turned to look at him then full on, those gray-green eyes catching the early light. You should know that I've been in situations before where the real numbers were hidden from me until it was too late to do anything useful with the truth. I'd rather not be in that situation again. Cade held her gaze. What kind of situations? A pause. Measured, deliberate the pause of someone deciding how much of a thing to hand over. The kind that teach you to count cattle at 5:30, she said. She stood, took both mugs back inside, and within 20 minutes was in the north pasture with a hammer and a roll of wire and a working knowledge of fence repair that she'd clearly not acquired from a book. Cade worked beside her. He told himself it was because the fence needed 2 people, which it did. That was a fact. He did not examine the other reasons with any particular honesty. They worked until midday, stopped to eat the biscuits she'd made from what remained in the larder, and worked another 4 hours after that. By the time they came in, the north line was solid enough to hold through winter, and Cade's shoulders ached in the specific, satisfying way they only ached when something real had been accomplished. You're good at that, he said, washing up at the pump. At fence work? At all of it. The way you... He stopped, started again. You work like you've got a reason. Mae dried her hands on a cloth and looked at the ridge going dark at its edges against the early evening sky. Everyone's working for something, she said. Most people just don't let themselves know what it is. What are you working for? She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Stillness, she said finally. I've been moving my whole life, not travel, not adventure. The other kind, the kind where you're moving because standing still feels like a target. She folded the cloth with precise corners. I want to stop moving. I want to be somewhere long enough to actually know the sound the wind makes in a specific set of trees. She went inside. Cade stood at the pump for another minute, water dripping from his hands, listening to the cottonwoods. 3 days passed. They established a rhythm without discussing it. Some rhythms don't require discussion. They simply emerge from 2 people occupying the same space with any degree of mutual competence. Up before light, coffee on the porch. Work through the heat, eat. Work again until the light failed. Evenings at the table with the ranch ledger open between them. It was the ledger that finally broke something open. Mae had asked to see it on day 2, and he'd handed it over with the specific dread of a man showing someone a wound. She'd sat with it for an hour without speaking, running her finger down columns, making small notations in the margins in handwriting that was compact and angular and entirely sure of itself. You're losing money on the hay sales, she said. Market rate. You're accepting market rate instead of setting your own. There's a difference. I don't have the leverage to set my own. Not alone. She turned the ledger so he could see where she'd been writing. There are 6 other ranches within 20 miles that are dealing with some version of this same problem. Sell too cheap because they have to move the product. Get squeezed by the same 2 buyers who know it. She tapped the margin notes. If you agree on a floor price across all 6 operations, the buyers can't play you against each other. Cade looked at the numbers, then at her. I've been running this ranch for 11 years, he said. Not hostile, just stating it. I know, no apology in it. And you've kept it alive through things that would have finished most people. That's not nothing, Cade. That's actually remarkable. She held his gaze. But remarkable survival and strategic growth are different skills. You've had to develop one. You haven't needed the other yet. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment and processed the experience of being told something true that he hadn't known was true until the precise moment it was said. You've done this before, he said. The business side. My mother ran a dry goods store from the time I was 7 until I was 20. Mae closed the ledger with careful hands. She taught me that the first number anyone offers you is a test to see if you know your own worth. The correct response is always to let them know you do. And after 20, when you left the store? The air shifted slightly, that same measured pause. After 20, I made some decisions based on trusting people who turned out not to merit it. She stood. The ledger details can wait until morning. We should check on the mare she was favoring her left foreleg this afternoon. She moved to the door. He watched her go. Later, lying in the dark listening to the cottonwoods and the sound of a ranch house that now held two people's breathing instead of one, Cade Rourke thought about what she'd said. The kind of moving where standing still feels like a target. He understood that, not from the same story she'd carried here, but from the specific way grief could make your own life feel hostile, the way a house full of things you'd failed to protect could become a place you endured rather than inhabited. He'd been standing still in the worst possible way, present in body, absent in everything that mattered. He didn't know what Mae Sutton was running from, but he recognized a person who had decided to stop. And something about that decision, the sheer difficult courage of it, reached into the locked part of his chest and turned a mechanism he'd been convinced was beyond turning. Redwood Flats made up its mind about Mae Sutton inside the first week. The town's verdict arrived in the form of Judith Calloway, who ran the general store and whose opinion on any given subject reached every household in town with a speed and accuracy that made the postal service look casual. They'd come in for supplies on Thursday. Mae moved through the store with her list compact, efficient, no browsing, while Cade settled the account with Judith at the counter. Judith had the particular gift of speaking to one person while performing for an audience of several. "I see you've gotten yourself a helper," she said, loudly enough for the three other women near the dry goods shelf to hear. "Quick work, Cade. Most men take a little longer to replace what they've lost." The store went quiet. Cade's jaw set. He knew this, had been expecting some version of it since Mae arrived. Before he could respond, Mae appeared at his elbow and set her items on the counter with a small, decisive sound. "You must be Mrs. Calloway," she said pleasantly. The pleasantness was precise, warm enough to be impeccably courteous, light enough to carry no vulnerability. "I've heard the store has the best salt pork in the county. I hope that's true because we've got a long winter to put up for." Judith blinked. "Ah, yes, we keep a quality stock." "Good." Mae placed her exact coins on the counter. "Because Cade's mentioned that he's been a loyal customer for 11 years, which I imagine means something to you. We intend to keep that arrangement." She picked up the parcel. "I'm glad we finally met." She moved to the door and waited without apparent urgency. Cade paid the remainder of the account, nodded to Judith, and followed his wife out of the store. On the boardwalk, Mae adjusted the parcel under her arm and said nothing about what had just happened. She simply turned in the direction of the wagon. "You didn't have to do that," Cade said. "I know." She kept walking. "You didn't have to be that careful?" She glanced at him. A slight curve at the corner of her mouth, the first thing adjacent to a smile he'd seen from her in 5 days. "I've been dealing with women like Judith Calloway my entire life. They mistake courtesy for weakness. The correct response is to be aggressively courteous until they run out of angles." He looked at her for a moment. "Aggressively courteous," he repeated. "It's a legitimate strategy." He almost smiled. "Almost. Where'd you learn that?" "My mother." She handed him the parcel to load onto the wagon. "She ran a store, Cade. You learn the full spectrum of human behavior behind a counter." The almost smile completed itself then, briefly and entirely against his will, and Mae Sutton looked at him with those steady gray-green eyes, and something moved in her expression, not a smile exactly, but the acknowledgement of one before she climbed up onto the wagon seat and returned to practicality. Cade stood with the parcel in his hands, and the rare warm weight of having laughed at something, even quietly, even briefly, and tried to remember the last time that had happened. He couldn't place it. He loaded the parcel, climbed up, pointed the horses home. 2 miles out of town, Mae said, who was the woman Judith Calloway was actually talking about? Cade was quiet. "You don't have to tell me," Mae said. "I just want to know what I'm actually navigating." He kept his eyes on the road. The cottonwoods at the ranch's entrance were just visible on the horizon. "Her name was Clara," he said. We were engaged 4 years ago. She left before the wedding." A pause. Not because of anything dramatic. Just because she looked at what this life was going to be and decided she wanted something different. She wasn't wrong to leave. He shifted the reins. The town decided it was a humiliation. Treated me like a man who'd been found insufficient. I stopped going into town much after that. Mae sat with this for a moment. "That explains the ledger," she said quietly. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "A man who doesn't feel worthy of walking into a room stops fighting for what he's worth in the room." She wasn't looking at him, was looking at the road ahead. "You've been accepting what people offer you because you stopped believing you could ask for more." The cottonwoods were close now, gold in the late light. "That's a significant thing to conclude from a general store confrontation," he said. "I told you, I learned a lot behind a counter." She picked up her bag from the wagon floor. For what it's worth, what Clara decided says nothing about your sufficiency. It says something about fit. Those are different things. She climbed down as the wagon stopped and carried her bag toward the house. Cade sat with the horses for a long moment. The cottonwoods moved in the wind. He sat there and let a truth he'd been refusing for 4 years settle into him like water into dry ground, slowly, thoroughly, changing the composition of things at a level below where anyone could see. The first real conversation happened on a night when neither of them could sleep. Cade came to the kitchen for water at midnight and found Mae already there, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cold mug, staring at something that wasn't in the room. She looked up when he came in. Didn't startle. Didn't pretend she hadn't been somewhere far from Redwood Flats, Montana. "Can't sleep?" he said. "Some nights are harder than others." She released the mug. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." "You didn't." He pulled out the chair across from her, made a decision, sat down. Bad memories or bad thinking? She considered the distinction. Thinking that leads to memories. "About where you came from?" A pause. Then, "About the person I was there, whether I brought her with me or left her behind." She looked at him steadily. "Do you ever feel like the worst thing that happened to you is also the thing you can't stop reaching for? Like it's the only solid object in a dark room, even though it cuts you every time?" He looked at the table between them, the grain of the wood, the notch near the edge where his father had once slammed a fist down, and the wood had taken the impact and held. "Yes," he said. "What's yours?" He should deflect. He knew how to deflect, had elevated it to something like an art form in the 3 years since he'd been alone. But something about the kitchen at midnight, about the specific quality of Mae Sutton's attention present without pressing, interested without requiring, made the usual deflection feel like more work than the truth. "My brother," he said. She was quiet, waiting. "Daniel. Younger by 3 years. He left when our father's drinking got bad. I was 17. He was 14. I understood why he went." Cade's hands were flat on the table. "I told him to go. The ranch was already going under, and I thought maybe if I kept him from seeing it happen, from being shaped by it the way I was getting shaped, he could be something else." "Where is he now?" "I don't know." The 2 words landed with the particular weight of long practice. He wrote twice in the first year, then nothing. "It's been 17 years. He looked up. "I stayed and kept the thing alive that drove him away. And I don't know whether that makes me loyal or just unable to imagine any other choice." Mae looked at him for a long moment. "Both can be true," she said. "Loyalty and limitation can live in the same house." He held her gaze. "What about you?" She looked down at the table, then back up with the expression of someone making a deliberate decision about how far to open a door. "I grew up in a town smaller than Redwood Flats," she said. "My mother's store was the center of it." She was the kind of woman who held things together without anyone noticing. That's what she was doing. Something moved through her expression. "She died when I was 23. And what I discovered after she was gone was that she'd been holding something back too. Not just the store together, something else." "What kind of something?" Mae's jaw tightened slightly, then released. "There was a man, Harlan Graft. He owned most of the town's debt by the time my mother died, including the store's debt. I didn't know about the debt until she was gone and he came to present it. She was very still. He presented the debt and an alternative to it simultaneously." Cade's hands went flat and hard on the table. He understood what she was saying. An arrangement. "A different kind of arrangement than ours." Her voice was level terribly, precisely level. "He was 61 years old. He had buried 2 wives. The people who owed him money called him patient. What they meant was relentless." She met Cade's eyes. "I signed over the store. I took what I could carry. I left." "Where did you go?" 3 different towns over 2 years. He has reach, Cade. The first fracture in the level voice. Small, hairline, but there. He has resources, and he has patience, and he has the absolute conviction that what he decides he wants belongs to him." She stopped. Steadied. "Which is how I ended up in correspondence with your lawyer, because I needed somewhere far enough and real enough to matter." Cade looked at her, at the set of her jaw, at the steady gray-green eyes that were holding everything, the fear, the history, the grim, competent courage of a woman who had kept moving because stopping felt like surrender. "He knows where you are?" Cade asked. "Not yet." She said it with quiet precision. "But men like Harlan Graft don't stop being interested. They just take longer than other men to act on it." Silence sat between them for a moment. Then you're not running anymore, Cade said. She looked at him. You're here, he said. You signed the papers. This is your legal address, your legal name, your legal— He stopped. Steady. I'm saying that if he comes, you have standing. You have ground to stand on. That's different from before. Something shifted in Mae's face. Not the hairline fracture this time. Something deeper and less controlled. A loosening. Like a knot that's been held so long the hand forgets it's been clenched. Is that an offer? She said quietly. It's a fact, he said. You're Mae Rourke. This is your ranch as much as it's mine. That's what the paperwork says. He held her gaze. And I don't go back on my word. She looked at him for a long time. I know, she said finally. That's the thing I knew about you from the letters before I ever saw your face. That you meant what you said and said what you meant? She looked down at the table. That's rarer than it should be. He didn't know what to do with that, so he sat with it, instead of doing something with it. Just let it be true in the room between them. After a while, she stood, took her mug to the basin. Get some sleep, Cade, she said. The south fence won't fix itself. She went to her room. He sat at the table for another quarter hour in the dark, and the house felt entirely different than it had before she'd said, I know. The threat arrived the way threats always arrive in a life that has otherwise begun cautiously hoping from a direction you weren't watching, in a form you hadn't quite imagined. It came in the form of a letter. Mae brought it in from the post on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into her time at the ranch. She stood at the end of the porch and held it without opening it, and the color left her face in a way that told him everything before she said a word. He set down the harness he'd been working on. You know who it's from, he said. The return address is a law office in Billings. She turned it over. But Harlan Graft uses lawyers the way some men use weather to arrive somewhere without showing his face directly. She opened it. He watched her read it. Watched her expression go from pale to blank to something harder and more deliberate than either. She handed it to him when she was done. Dear Mrs. Sutton, it began not Rourke, he noticed. Deliberate. Our client, Mr. H. Graft wishes to convey that he is aware of your current situation and location and bears you no ill will. He asks only that you return certain personal correspondence and business documents belonging to him that were taken when you vacated your previous residence. Upon their return, he is prepared to consider all previous matters concluded. He extends an invitation to meet at a neutral location at your earliest convenience. Should you decline this invitation, he regrets that he will be required to pursue the matter through other available means. Cade read it twice, set it down on the porch railing. What documents? He said. She was quiet for a beat. Before I left after he presented the debt arrangement, I wasn't just afraid. I was angry. Something fierce and controlled moved through her voice. I went through my mother's papers, found his correspondence with her over the years, the terms of the loans, the interest he'd applied without disclosure. Letters that showed he'd been deliberately driving the debt up. She met his eyes. The kind of letters that would interest a judge. You have evidence that he operated fraudulently. I have evidence that makes him nervous. She looked at the letter, which is why it's phrased as a request rather than a demand. He's not certain what I have, or what I've done with it. She straightened. He's probing. Where are the documents now? Safe. She said it simply and didn't elaborate, and he understood without being told that she'd arranged something careful and quiet, and that the details of it were the last piece of security she had left. Cade looked at the letter again, then at the horizon. Then at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had kept one thing alive through 11 years of various kinds of ruin and who understood implicitly the specific rage of someone trying to take what you'd built. You're not going to a neutral location, he said. No. And you're not returning anything? No. Good. He picked up the harness. We'll need to tell Patterson. The sheriff? He's not Graft's sheriff. He's ours. He resumed working the leather, his movements measured and deliberate. If Graft sends someone in person, Patterson needs to know there's a reason for it. Mae looked at him working for a moment. You're not, she started. Not what? Afraid of this. It wasn't an accusation, more like an observation of something she hadn't expected to find. He looked up from the harness. I'm not interested in what Harlan Graft wants. I'm interested in what we're going to do about it. He held her gaze. Are those the same thing to you? She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she picked up the letter, folded it precisely, and put it in her pocket. No, she said. They're not. Then we're all right. She went inside. He kept working the leather. The cottonwoods moved and the afternoon held, and somewhere on the north ridge, A hawk drew a long, slow circle in the August sky, like it had all the time in the world. Sheriff Tom Patterson was a deliberate man, not slow deliberate. He had the particular patience of someone who'd learned early that most problems revealed their own solutions if you gave them sufficient time and quiet attention. He listened to everything Cade and Mae told him on Thursday morning. Let them finish, looked at the letter, set it down. I know Graft by reputation, he said. Done some business with Billings men who've had dealings with him. He's the kind that applies pressure sideways, rarely comes directly at a thing. He looked at Mae. What kind of timeline does he usually operate on? Long. Mae's hands were folded on his desk, still and deliberate. He let my mother's debt accumulate for 8 years before he made his move. He's not impulsive. So this letter's an opening move, not a final one. Yes. Patterson nodded, made a note. Here's what I can do, and what I can't. Can't prevent someone from traveling to Redwood Flats, that's not a crime. Can make it very clear that anything that happens on your land, or to either of you, becomes my business immediately. He looked at them both. I'll know if any Billings men come through town. I've got eyes I trust. He stood. You did right coming to me. Outside, walking back to the wagon, Mae said nothing for half a block. Then, he believed me. Why wouldn't he? Because Harlan Graft is a creditor and a property owner and a man with lawyers. She said it matter-of-factly. And I'm a woman who left in the middle of the night with a bag and some papers. She looked at Cade. Patterson took my word as sufficient. Your word is sufficient. She looked at him. Something around her eyes shifted a tightening that he was starting to recognize as what happened when she was trying not to feel something she hadn't given herself permission to feel. I've spent 4 years in situations where it wasn't, she said quietly. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The main street of Redwood Flats moved around them. Mae. He said her name the way he'd say something that needed to be said clearly. Whatever happened in those 4 years, whatever Graft made you believe about your own word, your own standing, your own right to take up space and be believed that was him. That wasn't truth. He held her gaze. You're standing on ground that's yours now. That changes the calculation. She looked at him for a long moment in the morning light of a Thursday in August, and the thing around her eyes didn't release exactly, but it shifted into something else, something that wasn't fighting quite so hard against itself. You're unexpectedly forthcoming, she said, for a man who hasn't smiled voluntarily in what I estimate is a considerable amount of time. He blinked. That was almost a criticism, he said. It was almost a compliment. The corner of her mouth moved. There's a difference. He looked at her at the gray-green eyes and the slight curve, and the woman underneath all of it, who was steadier than anyone he'd ever stood next to, and felt something break open in his chest with a slow, irreversible quality, like spring ice on the river. Not a collapse, a release. He didn't do anything with it, wasn't ready to. But he registered it honestly for the first time, and put it somewhere he could find it again. Wagon, he said. Yes, she agreed. They walked back to it, their arms almost touched. He came on a Friday. Not Harlan Graft himself, Mae had been right about the directness, but 2 men, hired men, the kind whose purpose is legible from 20 yards. Cade was at the north fence when they rode up the track. He watched them come and set his tools down slowly, and went to meet them at the gate with the specific, deliberate calm of a man who has decided what he will and will not accept before the conversation begins. Cade Rourke, the taller one gray hat, roan horse, the rehearsed ease of someone who did this regularly. Depends on your business. We represent a client with an interest in speaking to a woman formerly known as Mae Sutton. We have reason to believe she's on this property. This property belongs to Cade and Mae Rourke. He said both names with equal weight. There's no Mae Sutton here. Our client. Your client sent a letter. Cade kept his voice level. She read it. Her answer is no. That was communicated through proper channels to the law office that sent it. He met the gray hat's eyes. You've ridden a long way for an answer you already had. Our client believes there are items in the woman's possession that belong to him. Your client can present that claim to a judge in Cascade County. Cade took a single step forward. Not aggressive. Definitive. And then we can talk about the other things those documents might reveal in a judicial context. Tell him that's her answer. The 2 men looked at each other. He won't like that, Gray Hat said. I don't require him to like it. Cade held his ground. I require him to understand it. Now I have a fence to finish. You're welcome to water your horses at the trough before you head back. They watered their horses. They left. Cade stood at the gate until they were off his land, and then he walked back to the fence and picked up his tools, and his hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from the specific adrenaline of having said what needed to be said, and held the line, and he breathed through it until they steadied. Mae came across the pasture 10 minutes later. She'd seen them from the kitchen window. "What did they say?" she asked. He told her exactly. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment. "You told them about the judicial context," she said, "about what the documents would reveal." "Yes." "That was smart." She paused. "That was also a gamble. If Graft decides to move against us directly, instead of retreating." "I know." "Cade, I know the risk." He turned to face her fully. "But I'm not going to stand on my own land and be reasonable about someone trying to take what's yours. That's not—" He stopped. Started again. "That's not who I'm willing to be." She looked at him. The afternoon was going golden around them, and the cottonwoods were moving, and she looked at him with those steady gray-green eyes, and whatever she was feeling moved through her face, like weather fast, complete, not entirely under her control. "Why not?" she said, barely above a whisper. He held her gaze. "Because you stayed," he said. "When this place showed you everything, it was the debt and the failing fences and the bad window and the hard winters ahead, you stayed. And you worked like you had a reason." He moved slightly closer. "Not closing the distance, standing in it. And you have a reason. And so do I." Mae Rourke stood in the north pasture of a ranch that bore her name and looked at a man who had been broken in his own specific ways and had decided not to let that be the final word about himself. And she did something he hadn't seen her do in 4 weeks. She let go. Not of everything, not all at once. But she stopped holding herself at that precise managed distance, and she exhaled, and something in her face went from composed to simply present, and she said, quietly and with complete honesty, "I didn't expect you." "No," he said. "I expected the arrangement." "So did I." She looked at him another moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not reaching toward him, just taking his hand, the way you take hold of something real when the ground has been uncertain. His hand closed around hers. They stood there for a moment in the north pasture, with the cottonwoods moving and the late light going copper on the ridge, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. Harlan Graft came himself 10 days later. Patterson had warned them. 2 hours' notice, a writer from town. A man matching the description came in on the afternoon stage, told him directly he'd need to state his business to me first. He stated it. "I can't stop him going to your land. I'll be an hour behind him." Mae read the note at the kitchen table. Set it down flat. "I want to be the one to speak to him," she said. Cade looked at her. "Mae, this has been mine to finish since before I came here." She met his eyes. The fear was there, he could see it, had learned to read the places where it lived in her face, but it was underneath something harder and more final. "I'm not asking you to step back. I'm asking you to stand beside me. There's a difference." He held her gaze. "Beside you," he said. "Yes." "Then that's where I'll be." Graft arrived an hour before sunset. He was older than Cade had pictured, mid-60s, thick through the chest, with the smooth, untroubled face of a man who had arranged the world around himself so thoroughly that resistance had become genuinely surprising to him. He was accompanied by one man. Legal, Cade guessed from the case he carried. They pulled up at the front of the house. Cade and Mae were on the porch, standing, waiting. Graft looked at Mae with the specific expression of a man recalculating a possession that has behaved unexpectedly. Then he looked at Cade with the expression of a man who does not find other men particularly significant. "Mae," he said, like a beginning of a longer sentence he planned to control. "Mr. Graft." Her voice was the voice she used at the general store, courteous, precise, containing nothing he could grip. "I received your letter." "And I received your answer through your lawyer." He stepped down from his horse with the deliberate ease of a man demonstrating that he is unhurried. "I thought a personal conversation might be more productive." "I disagree," she said. "But you've made the trip, so I'll hear what you came to say." He looked at Cade again, privately. "No." Mae didn't look at Cade when she said it, kept her eyes on Graft. "Cade is my husband and my partner, and there is nothing you have to say to me that he doesn't have standing to hear." Something moved through Graft's expression, not anger recalibration. "You've done well for yourself," he said, an observation edged with something that wasn't quite a compliment. "I expected you'd land somewhere?" "I didn't expect," he gestured at the ranch, at Cade, at the whole proposition of Mae Rourke standing on her own porch. Return the documents, he said finally, dropping the pleasantness. That's all I'm asking. Return them, and I'll call this finished. You can have your ranch and your husband and your Montana life, and I'll go back to Billings and we'll both pretend the last 5 years happened differently. Mae was quiet for a moment. The documents are in the custody of a judge in Helena, she said. Cade kept his face neutral. This was new information. They were submitted to the court 3 days ago. I've been working with a lawyer in Billings since the week I arrived here. She tilted her head slightly. You've been looking for me for 2 years, Mr. Graft. I've been building a case for 4 weeks. The silence that followed had a particular quality. Graft's smooth, unhurried face showed, for the first time, the outline of something beneath it. You can't prove. We'll find out what I can prove in court. She held his gaze. Or you can go back to Billings. Conduct your business without fraudulent interest schedules applied to people who can't afford lawyers to challenge them. And we'll find out in a different way. She paused. Those are the 2 options. The legal man with the case said something quiet and close to Graft's ear. Graft looked at Cade, directly, man to man, the way men sometimes appeal to each other over the heads of women. Cade looked back at him without any expression at all. She's spoken, Cade said simply. That's our answer. Another moment. Then Harlan Graft turned, remounted his horse, and rode back down the track with his legal man beside him and the long light of a Montana evening making everything look more peaceful than it was. Patterson arrived 40 minutes later, saw the retreating dust on the road, and looked at Mae and Cade on the porch. He's going, Patterson said. He's going, Cade said. Patterson looked at Mae. The documents will remain where they are, she said, accessible if needed, a deterrent until then. She looked at Cade. I sent them to Helena the day after his men came to the fence line. Cade looked at her. You didn't tell me, he said. I didn't want you carrying the weight of it until I knew it was solid. She met his eyes. I've been managing things alone for a long time. I'm still learning which things to carry and which things to share. He stood with that for a moment. We'll keep working on that, he said. Yes, she said, we will. Patterson made his notes, said his piece, rode back to town. Cade and Mae stayed on the porch as the light went out of the sky over the ridge and the first stars showed themselves above the cottonwoods. The cooperative met for the first time on a Thursday in September. 6 ranchers around Cade's kitchen table with Mae at one end and a ledger open in front of her that she'd spent 2 weeks preparing. She laid out the argument for a shared price floor with the precision and patience of a woman who understood both the numbers and the men reading them. By the end of the evening, they had 4 signatures. By the end of the month, they had 9. The hay buyers held out for 3 weeks and then accepted the new terms because the alternative was no supply at all, and that was not a workable alternative. Judith Calloway changed her tone in November when the cooperative's first shared profits allowed 2 member families to settle accounts they'd been carrying for years. She didn't apologize. Judith Calloway had not been assembled with apologizing as a feature, but she began referring to Mae Rourke as that capable woman Cade married, which, in Redwood Flats, constituted an endorsement of significant standing. The north fence held through the first hard freeze. The well recovered in October, as Cade had said it would. The east pasture, properly managed through the fall under a rotation system Mae had researched and implemented, showed the kind of grass come spring that made the older ranchers nod with the specific approval of people who measure worth in the quality of the earth. And in the long evenings of a Montana autumn, in the kitchen with the stove going and the ledger open, and the sound of the cottonwoods losing their leaves in the wind outside, Cade Rourke and Mae Rourke built the ordinary, extraordinary life of 2 people who had decided to stop being defined by what had broken them. It was not without difficulty. The habits of years, his silence, her managed distance, his tendency to carry things alone, her instinct to run calculations on every softness before allowing it did not dissolve. They were negotiated, slowly, in the ongoing way of people who are committed to being honest with each other, even when honesty is uncomfortable. One evening in October, the lamp low and the ledger closed for the night, Mae said without preamble, I'm not afraid of this anymore. He looked up from the window. Of what specifically? He said. Of this. She gestured at the table, at the kitchen, at the whole complicated reality of the life they were building, of wanting it. I've been afraid that wanting things makes you visible to the people who want to take them. She looked at him. But I think maybe the answer isn't to stop wanting. The answer is to build something too solid to take. He crossed the room and sat down across from her. We're doing that, he said. I know. She held his gaze. I know we are. I needed to say it out loud, that I want this, that I'm not here because I needed somewhere to be. She paused. I'm here because this is where I want to be. Those are different things. He reached across the table. She took his hand the way she had in the north pasture, certain, present, without ceremony. Mae, he said. Yes. I'm glad you stepped off that stage. She looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved, and the movement completed itself, and Mae Rourke smiled fully, without management, without distance, and Cade saw for the first time what she looked like when she wasn't holding anything back. It was a significant thing to see. He held on to it. The Cottonwoods came back in April. They did this every year, had done it for 60 years, but this April, Cade noticed it differently. Stood on the porch in the early morning with his coffee, and watched the green come back into the branches, and felt the particular quality of a man who is noticing his own life again after a long period of simply enduring it. Mae came out with her mug and stood beside him. The Hendersons are coming today, she said, to sign the cooperative papers. I know. That'll make 14 ranches. She looked at the Cottonwoods. We'll need to talk about formalizing the structure, a proper charter, maybe a shared account. I know. She glanced at him. You don't seem worried. I'm not worried. You were worried about everything 3 months ago. I was worried about everything before you got here. He drank his coffee. You're an effective treatment for a specific kind of worry. She looked at him, that steady, gray-green look that he had come to understand was the most honest thing about her, the thing that couldn't be managed or adjusted or held at distance. Effective treatment, she said. That's almost romantic. I'm working on romantic. I can see that. She looked back at the Cottonwoods. I never had a Cottonwood before. A specific one, I mean. One I knew the sound of. He remembered what she'd said that first week. I want to be somewhere long enough to actually know the sound the wind makes in a specific set of trees. Well, he said, now you do. She leaned slightly against his shoulder. Small movement, deliberate, entirely sure of itself. He stayed very still, so as not to break it. The Cottonwoods moved in the spring wind. The sound they made was the sound of something staying. And Cade Rourke, who had been broken in his own specific ways and had chosen not to let that be the last word, stood on his porch on an April morning with the woman who had taught him the difference between enduring a life and actually living. And understood, at long last, that the thing he'd been guarding all these years wasn't grief. It was capacity. And it had been waiting the whole time for someone steady enough to trust with it. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Mae and Cade's story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this is only the beginning of what we're building at Redwood Chronicles.